Good morning. This is Anna Imagination with the Healing Garden, and welcome to Shifting Perspectives. This is I'm solving problems. If you're new to my channel, I am a philosopher, sociologist, psychologist of 30 years. And I watched a documentary yesterday that basically took me into the third perspective. I don't work with the third perspective. I haven't been there in a very long time. I haven't watched news since Sandy Hook. I was in a call center that day, and the news came on. We had like televisions in the call center, and they were on all day long. And when Sandy Hook happened, I had to sit for 8 hours watching news coverage on this person who opened fire on a bunch of kindergartners. And because of my shitty fucking job, I could not leave and just hold my children, which is really what I needed that day. Every person in the world needed to just hold their children that day. I never watched news again. I realized the psychological damage of watching news that day. They argue that you're ignorant if you don't keep up with the times. And you do need to be aware of how bad things are in the world. The race fight and prejudice between races is not my fight because I'm a white girl. I can't relate. I can't comment. I don't know. In that area, I am a student. I have a very different way of looking at things. I am either a student or a master. And if you are not a master, I have the very firm opinion that you should keep your mouth shut. So, and this is why I spent 30 years keeping my mouth shut, because I wasn't a master of anything. I did not start teaching psychology until I mastered it. I did not start teaching philosophy until I mastered it. But you get me on a subject I know nothing about, and I'm not going to comment. I don't know. I can't comment. And people have done this to me. My brother would beat me if I did not comment. And I would say to him, I can't. I lack knowledge. Is it my responsibility to go out there and get knowledge so I can't comment? Absolutely. But what should I educate myself on? Now, over the last 6 months, I have been reaching out to minorities, Black people, asking them to please talk to me because I have so many questions. I have not been able to find one person that would be willing to sit down and talk to me. Now, I don't know. It could be trauma for them. It could be timing. It could be they're just busy. It could be a million things. I don't know. I'm still looking. I don't know. I was raised in a white town where there was one Black person the entire time. His name was Rodney, and he was the only person who showed me fucking kindness, and I love him. While all the other people in town treated me like fucking shit, he noticed me crying, and he was the only person who noticed me crying, and he comforted me and sat with me the entire time. He treated me like a human being, and he saw me. So I have a very warm, fuzzy place in my heart. And that was one of the first Black persons I had ever met. So that speaks volumes for me. I watched a documentary last night, and it was done by Daryl Davis. This is a Black man who fights racism by befriending Ku Klux Klan members. I will say this, because it took me a while to figure this out. The first 5 minutes of the video, he kept talking about the Klan, and I'm Scottish and Irish. So I'm like, which Klan? What's the name? Oh, he's talking about the clans. And it took me a while to realize he was referring to the Ku Klux Klan. And it took me, it didn't connect. I was just like, oh, he's talking about Klan members. I am McFarland. That is my Klan name. So I see the world differently. And the camera crew, the documentary took us into Baltimore. And I got to stand in the third perspective up close and personal. And I will be the first to tell you I'm fucking ignorant about the civil duress that's occurring in the country, because I haven't been able to watch the news since Sandy Hook. Now, Daryl did something very different. He did a lot of, you need to talk, just get them talking. Don't fight, talk. And I went, that's right. He's figured it out. There's more than that, but he was definitely right on the like, he was starting it. And at one point he sat down in Baltimore with several people. And one particular, he had two people with him. And they got into a discussion. They started getting angry and there was a lot of words, and then they just stopped. And Daryl called them ignorant. And that was the end of it. You can never call a third perspective ignorant. You should never call any of the perspectives ignorant. And I see what Daryl's doing, but, well, I'll be blunt. He lacks the perspective knowledge. So he didn't know how to talk to third perspectives. He can talk to fourth perspectives, which is what the Ku Klux Klan members were. And I watched him talking with the fourth perspectives. But when he got in with the third perspectives, he couldn't talk to them, because they require a different type of talking. And then this other man came over. He invited himself to sit down at Daryl's table. And all this man wanted to do was yell at Daryl and not listen. So I'm going to explain how to do this. This is 100% about our teacher-student relationship and mindset. People think that teacher and student mindset is something that exists only in schools. No. Teacher and student mindsets are something that follow us anytime you interact with another human being. Teacher-student mindset is actually an exchange of authority, power, and control. That's all it is. You are trading, you are negotiating your authority, power, and control for an emotional economic transaction. Now, the opposite of authority is vulnerability. When you enter into a conversation with someone in a student-teacher mindset, you have to either assume the role of the authority or the vulnerable. You cannot have both. And if you don't, communication doesn't happen. Negotiation doesn't happen. With a first, second, third, and fourth perspective, They have to be the teacher. You have to give them the role of teacher. And you have to assume the role of vulnerability. And you have to do so knowing that you may never get the role of teacher. Likewise, when you get to the 5th, 6th, and 7th, well, anything after the 5th perspective, well, I'm going to say 6th perspective, you then can take on the role of student. Or they then can take on the role of student. But you don't take on the role of student until you get to the 6th perspective. Now, there is an area of this where it gets really amazing and it's awesome. And I'll show you what that looks like. The 5th perspective is divided. Gen X is divided. That is one thing that we need to realize is first perspective is always going to be A. Second is A. 3, 4, A. 6 and up is B. But the Gen X's and the 5th perspectives are going to be divided. And if you get somebody who's a 5th perspective or a Gen X, you cannot assume one way or the other. When you get to a Gen X or a 5th perspective, you're going to have to evaluate them to determine where they fall. So I'm just going to look at the 3rd perspective. The reason why the younger, and this is where we have it backwards, and it seems like it should be X. It seems like, oh, well, they're younger, therefore they should be the student because I have so much to teach them. But that's not really what we're dealing with. In the case of teacher-student, it's a transaction. If you don't have a willing student, there's not going to be any teaching done. And the only reason why we force our children to be students is because we bully them into that role. We use our authority, we use our physical bodies, we use our physical authority to bully them into a vulnerable position. The problem is, truly, and according to Plato in the University of Alexandria, children should be the teachers. Because children are naturally people who play and imagine and create. And that is something we all can learn from. Adults are so terrible at imagination and creation that we need AIs to do it for us. Children have mastered the art of not giving a shit. How are you doing with that? Children are not people pleasers. How are you doing with that? Children love the self. How are you doing with that? I watched a video on Instagram last night. What would you change about yourself? They asked a bunch of children, what would you change about yourself? My favorite. I would have a mermaid tail. That's what I would change about my body. I agree. I would have a mermaid tail. I would have an option to have a mermaid tail. A boy said he would have superpowers. They asked all the other children, though, what would you change about your body? And the girl, all the people, all of them there, I wouldn't change anything. I love my body. How are you doing with that? So, children really need to be the teachers. But we don't. We bully them into these submissive roles, and we try and tell them what should happen. In the University of Alexandria, he had a different way of teaching. There was a line that was carved into the marble at the University of Alexandria. Let no man who has not studied geometry enter these walls. Now, when I first read this line, my thought was this. I have to go study geometry. Then I'll be ready. So I studied geometry. Now, I had an advantage because I loved art. So I already studied music, theater, dance, stage, comedy. It's all I did. And to be blunt, I got lucky. It was just pure love for knowledge, pure love for the arts, imagination, and creativity, and the luck of the universe that I happened to meet the requirements when I finally decided I just need to study geometry. At the University of Alexandria, the curriculum is different. Well, you know how you go to kindergarten and you have to learn reading, writing, arithmetic, mathematics, science, all kindergarten level. And then in first grade, you have to learn reading, writing, arithmetic, mathematics, science, all at first grade level. And then you have to learn reading, writing, arithmetic. That's not how they did it. When you're 1, you study music for 1 year. That's why children bang pots and pans on the kitchen floor. And then when you're 2, you study dance. Just dance for an entire year. And then you study song and singing. And then you study make-believe, which is fancy talk for theater and stage and improvisation. And then you study reading at 5 and story. And then at 6, you study writing. At 7, you study music, composition. And then you study physics. Then you study geometry. So when Socrates and Plato said, "Let no man who has not studied geometry," he's actually referring to, you have to study geometry and all of this first, so that when you get to geometry, you're ready for philosophy. And that is the next subject, is philosophy. Now, when I studied music, I was 15 years old, and you can't study music and music theory without studying physics, because, well, that's the circle of fifths, that's the frequency, those are the fractions, that's how music frequency works. It's all frequency. So when you study music theory, you study frequency and physics. So I studied physics when I was 15 years old, and then geometry, and then philosophy. And it continues from there. It's 1 year in each subject. And in philosophy, the first thing you study is logic, formal argument and debate. And then after that, you study how to learn. Well, actually, you study how to learn first, and then you study logic. And logic was actually part of how to learn. Now, this is the fun part. When you get back into music, dance, song, make-believe, reading, writing, right up to reading, what you are actually doing is learning how to be a teacher. So from the time we are born up to the time we are about 5 years old, when we are doing music, dance, song, make-believe, and reading, we are actually learning how to be a teacher. This is why. Because our beautiful brains are hardwired to learn through story, like Aesop's fables and parables. It's an actor who uses theater to teach, which is what Shakespeare knew, which is what Christ knew. which is what Aesop knew. So when you are in your first 5 years of life, you're actually learning all the tools to learn how to teach. And then when you start studying philosophy and you learn Socratic method and you learn logic, you learn to abandon prejudice and bias. And yes, this is an actual class that they teach in philosophy. And what you are doing is you are now learning how to learn. Now, from 0 to 5 years old, we all learned how to teach. Now you learn how to learn. Teaching comes first. Because we have mimic and repetition inside of our brains, it's mirroring. You must set an example. So when an adult acts like an audience or a student, they are actually teaching their children how to be a proper student. And then the students, the children, start to repeat the student model so that when the child is done with make-believe reading and writing, music and physics, they've repeated the parent who has learned to be quiet, ask questions, listen, no prejudice, open your mind, use logic, and learn. So now your 5-year-old plus is assuming the role of student to listen and learn and watch and observe, to mimic you at a time when they need to be learning now. Prior to that, they were teaching, and you were watching them, allowing them to play harmlessly at being a teacher. And adults need to learn this shit. Adults need to learn how to be creative and imaginative and to love the self. So that by the time the child moves into the teen years, they have assumed the role and the behavior of a student. But that's not what our society does. It reverses it. So the first 5 years of a child's life, they are introduced to a bullying, aggressive, condescending teacher, their adult parents, who lord their authority over them by saying, you can't do that. You need to not do that. You need to do this. You need to wear your jacket. You need to, which teaches the child how to be an authoritative teacher to an audience who doesn't listen. The third perspective is a 3-year-old mindset. They're just 3. Which means if you want to talk to a third perspective, you're really talking to a 3-year-old toddler child who likes to do things their own way and figure out their own path. It's not condescending. Condescension is when, to inflate your own ego, insecurity, confidence, you talk down and you belittle others who know less than you. So when I watched these third perspectives in this video lash out, I saw a bunch of adults with 3-year-old minds who never had the opportunity to teach, be heard, be validated. You cannot approach a third perspective as a teacher. They do not want to learn, and they shouldn't. That's not where their mindset is. Their mindset is still in the kindergarten room, learning how to sing. But when they tried to sing when they were 3, someone came along and told them, you can't do that. You have to be a fourth perspective now. And they got stuck. So if you want to talk to a third perspective, you can listen, you can be open-minded, you can be curious. You can put them on a pedestal and be vulnerable with them and let them show you how something is done. Then they will respect you. Now, there are dangerous people in the world. There are narcissists. And if they are an aggressive third perspective and they have decided to not like you, this could be dangerous. Use boundaries so that they don't turn you into a resource farm. Don't let them walk all over you. But if you are going to engage with a third perspective, keep in mind that there's no teaching them, nor should they be learned. That's not where they need to be. It isn't a you need to listen or you need to. It's not where they are. You don't start listening until you're about 5 or 6 years old. It's just where they are in their mental development. It's not good. It's not bad. It's a reflective of their abuse. When Daryl called that man ignorant, yes, they're ignorant. Everybody who is less than, well, everybody's ignorant, even me. Everybody's ignorant. We're all ignorant. Some of us, do assume the role of master when we know nothing about a topic. That's fear talking. We have a long way to go to fix this. If you go into a person's learning space and you tell them they're ignorant, or if you tell them about these perspectives, they're going to hear the hierarchical numbers of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I get this a lot with people. I'll sit down and I'll start talking to somebody about the perspectives and they'll say up. Oh, well, it's up there. And they immediately go into hierarchy. And it's one of the things that I stop often and say, stop. It is not an up here. It's an over there. This isn't hierarchy. There's no hierarchy. We don't look at a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old and say, you're better than them to the 5-year-old. We don't say to this 2-year-old, that 5-year-old's better than you. We don't do that. When the 10-year-old walks over to you and says, Mom, my 2-year-old sister's being an asshole, you don't say, well, you're better than them. We say, sweetheart, they're 2. They're just at a different stage than you. Different stage. That's all. We all have been abused. We all have multiple perspectives inside of our heads. You can't go in, and I remember this. I did this with my father. When I introduced my family to the perspective system, my father started to get upset, and he was like, he's this way and he's that. And I said, Dad, he's second perspective. He is? Yeah. It's just where he is. It's just a stage of development. He hasn't learned it yet. Oh, well, what am I? Well, you're third perspective, Dad. I'm 3. It's just where you are. Well, what's your mom? Mom is a 2. Mom is a 2. Oh, well, what are you? And at the time I was an 8, and I said, I'm an 8. And he was like, what? And he points to my son, and he's like, well, what about him? My son's a 5. He's bigger than me. It's not bigger, better, larger. I said, it's just different. Oh, and I watched his anger just calm because he understood. And then I watched, and I explained the same thing to my brother-in-law, and he calmed right down, and he was like, oh, and we started talking about, well, not about, but between the perspectives. And we started to observe the perspectives. Oh, that's how you're different than me. Oh, and then at one point, We did the New York City thing. We were moving my stuff inside, and you had to try and move the mattress inside, knowing that it was too small for the staircase, and that's okay. We had to try it anyway. I was an eighth perspective. I had to try it. And the second perspective had to try it. But the third perspective already knew. So the third perspective finally understood, you got to figure it out for yourselves. And he stepped back and he went out and he had a cigarette and he chilled while we tried to figure out the geometry of getting a mattress up a narrow staircase that was never going to fit. And it was this realization, this moment of just, I understand. It's the lack of understanding, it's the lack of education that's causing a lot of the anger. But you've got a lot of people who don't value education because they haven't had a good positive experience with it. Because they were forced to be a student against their will. But every time we open our mouths with another human being, we are entering into a teacher-student relationship. And someone has got to assume the role of student. And it's not hierarchy. It is not about who is better or who is higher. The highest perspective should always be the one to be a student first. The higher perspective should always take the low road or the vulnerable road. We think of resources as something physical that we can have, like money or food. But there are other resources. There is information and knowledge. There is power. And when you have, basically whoever has the most resources has the most power. But we're only looking at the physical resources. Height is a resource. If you're short, you're going to be at a disadvantage. Muscle is a resource. If you don't have muscle, you're not going to have a resource. The hierarchy system that we live in compares resources to determine who has the most power, who has the most authority, and who should be in charge, and who should be vulnerable and at the bottom. And it's not how it works. This is how fourth and third and second perspectives think. This is not how it works. There's a whole nother area here that's not being considered. And once you start recognizing all the resources and you start realizing the economics with the exchange of teacher-student, with the exchange of authority, power, control, no one is going to go anywhere. And this is a real fine-tuned, this is the key, literally the key to fixing this, is understanding the exchange and the balance and value of all the resources with what's going on with a teacher-student role, with how to exchange that authority, power, control for vulnerability balance. And until we figure this out, well, I have figured it out, until we all learn this, we're not going to see the change we need to see. Now, I have seen it, where as soon as I pass this information on over to people, their entire perspective changes. And suddenly they're like, this is what's going on. It is a massive light in the confusion. It's a massive light in the confusion. Understanding this helps you understand what happened when you were a child and when you were abused. Suddenly you understand, oh, I had resources and my resources were not valued. Those are big words. I had resources and my resources were not valued. And I had somebody who had less resources than I completely steal my resources or lord theirs over me. And then they forced me into a student vulnerable role without my consent. Non-consensual teaching is a real problem. And you can't just walk in and assume the role. And it's not a trade. You're not going to get a trade in some cases. You don't walk in and say, I'm going to teach you a lesson and then you get to talk. It doesn't work that way. How many of us had that happen to us with our parents where something happened, they assumed, they sat us down, they lectured us, and we never got a chance to talk? That's abuse. And then we walked away bitter and angry because they provided non-consensual education without even considering our resources, without properly weighing in our authority, and without consenting, allowing us to consent to being vulnerable with them. I have a word for that, and it's not a pretty word. Rape is not something that happens just with sex. Rape is a word that means non-consensual. And that bottom line, that's what happens to a lot of us is we have non-consensual education, non-consensual exchange of resources, non-consensual vulnerability. And almost every one of us has been victim to this. And that leaves us feeling exposed, vulnerable, taken advantage of, underappreciated. And then we don't understand it because the words are not there for us to grasp. It's an ugly word. Yesterday, I used the words farmed for your resources. And I felt so sick to my stomach, but it's true. There's a lot of people who are farmed for their resources. And then you walk away from those situations feeling sick and you don't know why. Well, the words for what you're looking for is non-consensual education, non-consensual vulnerability, farmed for your resources, invalidated resources, undervalued, taken advantage of by people who should be teaching you this. And it's not that they're malicious. In most cases, they're just unaware because this information is new. Not new. Plato, Socrates had it all figured out, and we lost it. So there's a lot more to it. This is just another little sliver. But I'm going to start going through all of the perspectives. It is vital that, and here's the basic rules. Rule number 1, do not assume the role of teacher if you are talking to a perspective that is less than 5. Assume that you're going to walk into that situation as a student. Invite them to teach you and go in expecting to not get the same invitation. Until they assume the role of teacher, until they accept it with consent, do not mention the perspectives to them. The reason why is because they're going to hear a hierarchy system of you're better than them. And they're not going to be in a position to learn. So if you try and explain the perspectives to somebody who is not in a teacher mindset or a student mindset, they're not going to hear the right lesson. And it will create prejudice. And don't do that. Do not just blast this information out and say, oh, there's perspectives, because the society is going to hear just the hierarchy, and there is no hierarchy. But you don't get that till you're in the 6th perspective and you go, oh, there's no hierarchy. It's all equal. Because the 6th perspective is when you learn equality. So they're going to hear this information without the ethic of equality, sixth perspective. So you're going to have to teach them that with these perspectives. But if you start right off with, there are these perspectives, and you leave out the fact that equality is a huge part, is all of this, they're not going to hear that. So it's vital that if you're going to explain these perspectives to somebody, that you start off by inviting them to become your teacher. And then only after they accept the invitation do they assume the role of student. And then you start off by saying, there is an equality system, the stages of growth that are equal. And then you can explain the perspectives to somebody. Because anything less than that setup, and it's not going to be perceived properly. They're going to hear that competitive, oh, you're better than me. And if you have not established a solid ground in which to grow on, it's not going to go that way. Understand that when you decide to teach somebody and when you decide to learn from somebody, you are actually in a vulnerability authority exchange. Somebody's going to have to assume the vulnerable role. And if you don't feel secure and safe, you're going to resist that, which is why you end up with two teachers. That's when arguing and screaming matches begin, is when you end up with two teachers. That's your power struggle, because somebody is forcing somebody else into the role of student, and it was without their consent. This is like 99% of the causes of all domestic violence cases, is because you have somebody who wants to be a teacher and they are non-consensually forcing someone into a student role. Usually it's a man to a woman or an adult to a child, and the child or the woman resist, and now you've got the conflict. It's because they did not consent to vulnerability. So once you understand that authority, vulnerability, power exchange with teacher student, and if you listen to students today, everyone goes to school and the children are all saying the same thing. I don't want to go. They're making me go. And if I don't go, the truant officer is going to arrest me. Non-consensual students. Now you have a bunch of people who are being forced into an education system that they don't want. Instead of making it fun and enjoyable, they're using force and non-consent to force education onto our children who are now not learning because it's ridiculously horrible and it's a horrible education setting. So now they are associating education with non-consent, which is why a lot of people hate learning. Because it's not fun and it's rape. And a lot of people walk away from school in their senior year going, never again. It's not fun and it's rape. Yeah. Don't blame you. We really need to change the way we do our education system. The third perspective, never learned. Trust. It is what they have to learn. It's their journey. It's their educational journey. Every perspective has an educational journey. And a third perspective is learning how to trust others and learning how to trust themselves. And it's accepting their own vulnerabilities. It is, their own limitations. It is learning to accept your own limitations. It is learning how to ask for help. Everything's on a spectrum. You have your, I'm going to be isolated and independent and alone. And in the third perspective, the individual has gone all the way over to independent. They are supposed to be so independent and so alone and so lonely that they finally get sick of it. They snap and they swing back into the balance of community and isolation. But in almost every case of a third perspective, what ends up happening is when the third perspective swings over here to full isolation, people, enablers, pull them back into the community by force. So the independent, isolated, and alone third perspective is non-consensually being forced into community. They're never going to get sick of independence. They are going to become terrified of being alone. And because they are forced to converse in a community without the required skills learned, internalized, trust, asking for help, valuing community, they're instead going to start farming people for resources. This is how narcissism develops. They would not do this if people, usually fourth perspectives, would just leave them alone and let them isolate. And when an empath or an enabler steps into their life and takes care of them and ensures that they're never alone because they're afraid of being alone, then the third perspective starts to farm the enabler. The authority, the power, and the control lies 100% with the enabler. The empath is the one with all the authority and the power in that situation, all of it. If the enabler is not aware of their authority and power, then they continue to get farmed. In order to stop the farming process, they have to leave the third perspective alone and provide them with pure and total isolation. Once that happens, then they finally get so sick of being alone that they value community, and then they come back. But they have to get sick of isolation. This happens with the aggressive third perspective, the narcissists. It also happens with the passive. The passive third perspectives are your hyper-independent, avoidant people. The hyper-independent, avoidant people are... Daryl Dixon is an example of this in Walking Dead. He is a hyper-avoidant third perspective. In the episode when he is with Beth in that gross cabin that they burned down, you see him switch from third to fourth perspective. It is in the line when he says, well, he's isolated, he's independent, he's alone, and he finally has the breakdown. It's when he cries. And then afterward, if you watch, he's sitting there on the porch with Beth, and he says the words, "We should go inside now." When has Daryl Dixon ever wanted to go inside? That's when he switches over to the fourth perspective. That is the moment when you see that he's now in the fourth perspective. A third perspective, they prefer, and he says it like all up to that point in the show, he says, I want to be outside. I'm going to be outside. I'm more comfortable outside, until that moment when he says we should go inside. And it's because he switched from the third to the fourth. And what changed was he finally had enough of isolation. But they're not going to get enough of it. They're not going to gorge themselves on the isolation to change until they are left alone. They must be left to isolate. I call this the walkabout perspective. And if you don't allow them to go on walkabout, they're never going to get out of it. And that's when their psychological chemistry, their psychological makeup is going to turn toward the people, because they don't value the people, because they haven't learned to do that yet. And they're going to start farming people. Narcissists are made. They're not born that way. They're made that way by people who will not leave them alone when they should be on walkabout. That's why every time you see them forcing Daryl into that stage of independence, of being with the community when he needs to be alone, it doesn't work. The worst thing you could do is be supportive and with a third perspective who needs to be alone. If they say they need to be alone, give them the space, let them isolate. Give them the isolation they're afraid of, because they're gonna have to learn. Let them know, hey, I'll support you if you need it, but I'm going to support you from over here. And these are the boundaries and these are the rules. The reason why you become an enabler or an empath, or you get caught up into that narcissistic cycle, is because you are not setting boundaries. And that's 100% on the enabler. Now, there are aggressively dangerous people. Don't fuck with those ones. Get away if you can. That's a whole nother creature. Get away. If they are a psychopathic or a psychotic narcissist, get the fuck out. Don't try to fix that. Just get out. But the worst thing, and this is where I'm huge on, 2 years before you get into a relationship. This is why I say 2 years, because no one can keep up all of their psychological armor for 2 years. No one can do it. After 3 months, you're going to start to see all their psychological flaws and red flags. But if you're jumping into a relationship within the first 2 weeks of meeting a stranger, you need to see 2 years of them before you know who you're with. 2 years. Because the subconscious mind can't keep up any facade longer than 2 years unless they limit access to you. So if you know somebody and they're on the road all the time and you've known them for 5 or 10 years, but you're only seeing them bits and pieces, that's not going to cut it. If you are with them all the time for 2 years, if you are in a friendship with them where you're observing them and you're keeping up your boundaries, you're going to see their truth real fast. You're going to see it real fast. But 2 years is a fantastic, all right, it's been 2 years. We've been friends. I've been using boundaries. I have a pretty good idea of how you are. If you're educated on psychology, you can expedite that time frame. I'm really good at psychology, and I still have this 2 years because, because people lie, because people do limit how much access I have to them. So I can't make an assessment until I see their full behavior for 2 years. And it's an ensuring way of, hey, this is somebody I can trust. Now I'll bring them into my circle. So leave the third perspectives alone. They need it. What is good for you is not good for them. And this is really it, is the enabler has a completely different type of makeup. They're going, well, I need people. And yes, an enabler, a giver does need people. They need the community. They do need the support, and they do need giving love because they are a giver. And they have projected their needs onto the narcissist, which is actually a toxic cocktail for the narcissist, and it encourages them. So a boundary would actually stop you from projecting all of that onto the narcissist. Yep, that's all I have to say about the third perspective. Thank you so much, and may the kindest of words always find you.